When you configure an IP4 address for a Windows 10 client, you need to configure several things. The first, obviously, is an IP address. The second is a subnet mask. This determines how much of the IP address represents the host address and how much represents the network and subnetwork address. The default gateway. This enables routing from this device to devices located on other networks. And one or more DNS server addresses. DNS server is used to resolve names. You'll probably spend most of your time assigning private IP addresses to devices on your organization's networks. But all devices that connect directly to the internet, such as routers, must have a public IP4 address. These addresses are assigned usually from an ISP from IANA. Network Address Translation, or NAT, is used to enable conversion from private IP4 addresses within your organization to public IP4 addresses outside your organization. There are three classes of address that are used. For Class A, you can use the range 10.0.0.0/8. For Class B private addresses, you can use 172.16.00/12. And for Class C networks, 192.168.00/16. It's this last one that we probably find most frequently in home networks. In many situations, you can use simple subnetting. In simple subnetting, you take an address, in this case 192.168.17.1, and you use whole octets to define the network and subnetwork ID. In this case, the first three octets are indicated as being part of the subnet ID through the use of the subnet mask 255.255.255. The last octet is 0, which means only the last octet represents the host address. So this is host 1 in subnet 192.168.17.0. When you're using IP4 subnetting, there are a number of default IP classes. Class A, you can define a Class A address by using the IP address 1 to 127 in the first octet. The default mask for Class A addresses is 255.0.0.0. This gives you 126 different networks, each of which can contain up to 16,777,214 hosts. So a small number of fairly large networks. Class B is perhaps a bit more useful. Indicate a device as having a Class B network by using the first octet in the range 128 to 191. The default mask is 255.255.0.0, in other words 16 bits. This gives you 16,384 networks, each containing 65,534 hosts. Class C networks start 192 through 223. They use 24 bits, or 255.255.255.0 in the mask. This gives you a little over 2 million networks, each containing 254 hosts. For the exam, it's important that when you see an IP address, study the first octet to determine the class. That will help you determine the default mask. If you've got a more complex network, you may not want to use whole octets, so you may use a variable number of bits. We have the same host here, it has the same IP address, 192.168.17.1, but we're using a mask which uses not 24 bits, but rather 20 bits. This is indicated by 255, that's 8 bits, 255, that's 8 bits, and 240, which is 4 bits. This leaves 12 bits to describe each of the hosts within the network. So that's more hosts, but fewer networks and subnetworks. This device is in fact located in network 192.168.16.0. That may not appear obvious when you study that third octet. But that's because, in binary at least, the first digits in the third octet match. For the exam, you're going to be expected to identify devices and work out which network they're located in. If you're not sure from the small summary that we've done here, Google subnet addressing and see if you can find out more. The following tools are available for configuring a device for IP4 in Windows 10. Network and Internet Settings, Network and Sharing Center, the network setup wizard, Windows PowerShell. For example, you can use the new net IP address commandlet to configure an additional IP address on a network interface. The netshish command. For example, the netshish interface IP4 set address command can be used to assign an IP address and related information to a network interface. Let's take a look at some of this in action. In the demonstration, I'm going to show you how to configure IP4 using the graphical user interface by using Windows PowerShell, and finally to enable automatic IP4 configuration. Okay, so there are a number of different ways that you can configure IP4 on a Windows 10 host. One possibility is to open up Network and Sharing Center and then to click on Change Adapter Settings. Right click the adapter you want to reconfigure and then click Properties. And then here you can see the IPv4 protocol. Click Properties and then reconfigure it. Alternatively, from within Network and Sharing Center you can also click on, in this case, the Ethernet link, which represents a network connection. And you can click Details to view the configuration of that particular interface. And you can choose Properties to reconfigure the network connection. And then there you are, you can see the IPv4 protocol again. In the graphical user interface, you can configure a number of things regarding IP4. Let's click on Properties here. You can specify an IP address, or you must specify an IP address, a subnet mask, and a default gateway. The default gateway is used for routing, so you can actually manage without it if you only want to communicate within the local subnet. But I'll enter an IP address there for the local gateway. And then there are some options you can configure on the Advanced Property page. This is a summary of the IP settings, but you can add additional IP addresses, so you can configure multiple IP addresses on the same network interface if you need to. Down here we specify a preferred DNS server for name resolution purposes. If you want, you can configure several DNS servers, so an alternate if the primary is not available. And again, on the Advanced Property sheet there's a DNS tab that allows you to configure some additional characteristics. This is the first DNS server here, but you can add multiples and then set a preference order. You'll also notice down here that the option to append the primary and connection specific DNS suffixes is set. I'll talk more about that when we look at DNS later in this lesson, but essentially you can configure several suffixes to a connection if you want to, and append them in a specific order. A suffix is something like pearson.com or education.pearson.com. We've also got the options down here to register the connection address in DNS and to use the connection's DNS suffix in DNS registration. So a number of options that pertain to advanced DNS settings. The Wins tab, it's not really used anymore. For those organizations that are not using DNS or that have legacy NetBIOS based applications, the Windows Internet Name Service, or WINS, can be used to perform name resolution. These days, most organizations and most applications rely on DNS, so this is something you're not going to see very often. When you've configured the settings for IP4, you can click OK and then Close. You can see the network adapter is identifying the local network since we've changed some settings. You can also configure IP settings using the command prompt and Windows PowerShell. Let's take a look at the command prompt. I should probably open it actually in elevated mode. So there's an elevated command prompt. I can use the ipconfig command. By itself, it will display the basic IP4 configuration. As you can see here, we've got the IP address, the subnet mask, and the default gateway. It's also showing us the linked local IP6 address. If I want some more information, I can use ipconfig/all. That allows me to see that this is a manually configured IP address because the DHCP enabled value is set to no. And it provides me with information about the DNS server address as well. I can also use the netshish command from the command prompt to reconfigure network settings. Here I'm saying netshish interface IP4 and then set address name equals Ethernet, that's the interface name, source equals static as opposed to DHCP, and then the IP address, the subnet mask and the gateway. If I type ipconfig again, we should see that the address has changed from 172.16.0.101 to 172.16.16.2. And there we are. So you can use the netshish command to interact with and reconfigure the network settings on your network interfaces from the command prompt. You can also use Windows PowerShell. So, for example, similar to the ipconfig command, we can use the get net IP address commandlet, and it will show us some basic information about the network. You can see here this IP address 172.16.16.2, the one we just configured with netshish, is applied to an interface which has an index number of 3. That's just a unique way of identifying each of the network interfaces. It also has an interface alias of Ethernet, so that's its network interface name. It's an IP4 address of type unicast, and the prefix length, in other words the subnet mask, is 16 bits or 255.255.0.0. This is quite a lot of information there, very similar to the output on ipconfig. We can also use the get net IPv4 protocol command to find out a bit more about IP4 specifically. So you can see some information about root cache limit here, ICMP redirects, IGMP level, IGMP version and so on. So a bit of additional information about IP4. If you want to reconfigure the IP address by using Windows PowerShell, you can do that too by using the new net IP address commandlet. So here I'm saying new net IP address, interface index is 3. I could also use the interface name. The address family is IP4. The IP address is going to be 172.16.0.205 and a prefix length of 16 bits. And you can see that that's come back and reported it's made that correction. If I type get net IP address, you should see that that change has been reflected up here. I can also see it with ipconfig, and although ipconfig is a command line tool, command line tools can be run within the Windows PowerShell window. So we can see we've got multiple IP addresses. The primary one is 172.16.0.205. We've also got 172.16.16.2, so it added that address rather than replaced it. We can also use the remove net IP address to get rid of the old IP address if we want a single IP address assigned. Finally, we can take a look at configuring the IP address automatically. If I open up Network and Sharing Center again and then click on Change Adapter Settings, right-click the Ethernet adapter and choose its properties, and then click Properties for the Internet Protocol version 4, I can choose the Obtain an IP address automatically option and also obtain DNS server address information automatically, and then click OK and then Close. You can see immediately that it's recognized it's connected to a domain network, pearson.com. If I click on the Ethernet link here in Network and Sharing Center and then click Details, you can see it has an IP address of 172.16.0.100. Now we didn't assign that. That was assigned by DHCP. We can see that the IP address of the DHCP server is given here, 172.16.0.10. You can see similar information if you open up a command prompt. I don't need to run this particular command elevated, but it's a force of habit. If I type ipconfig, you can see the IP address is 172.16.0.100. If I use the /all switch, we can see that it's DHCP enabled is yes, and it tells us something here: the lease obtained and the lease expires. With DHCP, you obtain the use of an address for a period of time, or more accurately, the use of an IP configuration for a period of time, known as the lease period. The lease period defaults to 8 days, but that's configurable on the server. So as you can see here, we obtained it on Wednesday, March the 14th, and it's going to expire on Thursday, March the 22nd. Now, obviously, what we wouldn't want to have happen is for the address to expire and for us to cease communicating on the network. So the client will automatically attempt renewal during the lease period. Typically that takes place when the computer starts up each day and also at half time to live, or in other words halfway through the lease duration. Generally speaking, it will simply renew the same address again from the same server, but on rare occasions that may not be possible, and we can talk a bit about that when we look at troubleshooting in a lesson later on in this particular chapter. In the demonstration, you saw how to configure IPv4 graphically, how to configure IPv4 using Windows PowerShell, and how to enable automatic IP configuration.